So the third lecture on chapter 27 is going to be on acid-base balance or acid-base homeostasis. And so we're first going to start with a really quick review of pH from Bio 137. Okay, pH means potential hydrogen. It's how much hydrogen can be released in solution. So a solution can either be neutral or acidic or basic. Acids release hydrogen ions into solution, and bases remove hydrogen ions from solution. They do that by releasing something called a hydroxide ion into solution. A hydroxide ion is OH. So if you mix an H and an OH, you're going to get water. They neutralize each other. So that's how bases remove hydrogen ions from solution. And now look at this. I said this back in A&P 1. Carbonic acid is a weak acid that's essential to homeostasis in the respiratory, digestive, renal, and cardiovascular systems. Okay? So I gave you a hint that we were going to do when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid long time ago. Okay, we measure the relative acidity of a solution using the pH scale. It's based off the exponent of the concentration of hydrogen ions. So let's look at that, right? So concentration of hydrogen ions. Anything in a bracket like that means concentration. So here it's about 10 millimoles per liter. Here it's about 1 millimole per liter, trying to move the decimal point in my head. Here it's about 0.1. So I think I'm actually moving the decimal point the wrong way because that's a negative exponent. So what we do as biologists to try to get around having to do math or chemistry is when we measure the pH of the solution, we take that exponent and we just turn it into a unit on this pH scale, right? So it goes from 0 to 14. 7 is neutral, and that's going to be pure water. That's where your hydrogen ion and your hydroxide ion exactly equal one another. Anything more this direction is becoming more acidic. It's releasing more hydrogen ion. Anything going this direction is becoming more basic, is releasing less hydrogen ion. Okay? Where this can get really tricky for people is the increasing concentration of hydrogen ion, the increasing acidity is a lower number, right? So 2 is more acidic than 3. You wouldn't think more acidic would be a lower number, okay? But anything going that direction to the left on this particular figure has more hydrogen ion, it's more acidic, and that's a lower number. More basic is the higher number. Okay, and they put all kinds of stuff on here, but if you look, most of our body fluids, saliva is a little bit acidic, but blood is in this 7.2 to 7.4 range. Urine can have a pretty wide range because that's how we get rid of the stuff that we don't need, right? We dump it in the urine for excretion. So if our blood is kind of acidic, and we need to dump all that acid, then urine's going to get kind of acidic too to get rid of it. If our blood is kind of basic and we're starting to dump bicarbonate, then our urine's going to get a little bit basic too. Urine has this big range because everything we don't want in the blood to keep the range of the blood real tight, we dump in the urine. Okay, so if you add a base to an acid and they're equal amounts, the H and the OH will form water. So that's the chemistry of neutralization. Here's the figure where I showed salts and buffers. We looked at this in the last lecture just now when we did electrolyte balance. Here's a table that's in your book that reviews some of these terms that we just used. This is table 27.3 in this chapter. The pH is the negative log of the hydrogen ion concentration. Neutral is a solution with a pH of 7 because that has an equal number of hydrogen and hydroxide ions. Acidic is a solution with a pH below 7 because it has more acid. Basic or alkaline is above 7 because it has more OH. Salt, an ionic compound consisting of a cation other than hydrogen and an anion other than hydroxide, which is this right here. Because if its cation was hydrogen, it'd be an acid. If its anion was hydroxide, it'd be a base. It's everything else that forms a salt. Not just table salt, but any of these electrolyte compounds are considered to be a salt. And then a buffer is going to be anything that tends to oppose changes in the pH, tries to keep the pH at equilibrium, tries to keep the pH at homeostasis by removing or replacing hydrogen ions. Okay, so buffer systems act quickly to try to prevent large pH changes. So they can temporarily bind up hydrogen or release hydrogen to try to keep the hydrogen concentration in that real tight range. Here's a figure from your book that we're going to talk through that shows some of these different buffer systems. And in A&P 1, I showed this protein buffer system. Because in A&P 1, we were learning the structure of the amino acid. The amino acid is organized around a central carbon. On one end is this carboxyl group. On the other end is the amino group. Here's the side chain. And here's an H. And so if pH rises and things become too basic, this H can fall off. And now it's free in solution and it makes the pH a little more acidic. But if pH falls, then this hydrogen ion can get attached and then it's no longer in solution affecting the pH. It's attached to this protein buffer. Okay, so that's a quick review of things that you should already have understanding of. And so one of the major homeostatic challenges is trying to keep that hydrogen ion concentration in that real tight level from about 7.2 or 7.3, no more than about 7.45. Whenever I was in the lab, when I was a grad student, if I was perfusing cells with solution, the solution always had to be between 7.2 and 7.4. If it got outside that range, then whatever the cells were doing wasn't really physiologic because we have these mechanisms that maintain the pH of arterial blood that tightly. The way we do it is we have these several buffer systems that can pick up and drop off hydrogen ions as needed. We breathe out CO2. You're going to learn how that impacts acidity of solutions in the body. And the kidney can excrete hydrogen ion. So if we have too much of it and we can't really attach it to buffers anymore, we can just dump it and get rid of it. Now, acid-base balance is really important for a number of things that we've talked about since the beginning of Bio 137, but I want to remind you that proteins have to be folded properly in order to have their function, and they're very sensitive to changes in pH. pH is one of the ways that the stomach starts to digest proteins up by denaturing them so that enzymes can have better access to those peptide bonds to break them down. We produce a lot of acid through our regular metabolic reactions. Diets with large amounts of proteins produce more acid, which can acidify blood. But anything like lactic acid or any metabolic processes that produce acid can affect acid-base balance. So how does acid-base balance work? We have 4 acid-base imbalances. 2 are acidosis conditions. This is a physiological state from where our blood pH gets low, it gets acidic. Alkalosis is the physiological state where our pH gets high when we hit alkalosis. The nervous system and the cardiovascular system are particularly sensitive to changes in blood pH. Normal cellular activity generates acids, so acidosis tends to be a little more common, but both acidosis and alkalosis are cause for concern, and if the body doesn't bring us back into homeostasis naturally, then that would be cause for intervention. So we talked a little bit about buffer systems in Bio 137, particularly that protein one. Now we're going to talk mostly about this carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system. The protein buffer system can function in the intracellular fluid inside the cell as well as in blood plasma. In fact, when the red blood cell picks up carbon dioxide at the tissue, CO2 combines with water and hydrogen ion is formed, and we said it binds to hemoglobin because hemoglobin can buffer those pH changes. That's this hemoglobin buffer system. Okay? Those amino acid buffers can be both inside the cell, or if they're plasma proteins, they can be in the blood plasma. Anywhere you have amino acids, that amino acid buffer system can function. But the carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is the most important in the extracellular fluid. This gives you in words what we were just talking about the protein buffer system. If the pH rises, that carboxyl group can come apart and release a hydrogen ion. If the pH decreases, it can accept a hydrogen ion. And then some of the amino acids on their side chains have some of these H and OHs that can also buffer hydrogen. And here's the figure that we can look at for that. Now, one of the things that I think makes this figure a little bit confusing, they try to use the same color convention as the pH scale they've already showed you, but they don't keep the left and right orientation the same. So here they're saying if pH falls, and while they've kept all this in red, in the previous figure, red and acidic and lower pH went that way. In this figure, pH falls and acidic go this way. So you have to be sure and read the figure carefully. This talks about if pH falls, that excess hydrogen ion can get picked up. In acidic medium, it can absorb that hydrogen ion. And then here they're keeping that blue convention. It just happens to be on the opposite side as the previous figure. But this says if pH rises in alkaline medium, this amino acid can act as an acid and release that hydrogen ion into solution. And that will help bring the pH back down. So we've talked about it all semester. You should have a really good understanding of this equation. When carbon dioxide dissolves in water, it forms carbonic acid, and this is catalyzed by the enzyme carbonic anhydrase. Carbonic acid is a very volatile acid, and it very readily falls apart into a hydrogen ion and a bicarbonate ion. So this reaction is reversible, and so it can kind of find an equilibrium. Now, one of the things that if you've had any chemistry, you know, if you end up with an excess of reactants, it pushes the reaction to the right. And if you end up with an excess of products, that pushes the reaction to the left. Okay. I wanted to just kind of show you quickly, kind of give you the visual example of that.
Le Chatelier's principle says that if you induce a stress on a system at equilibrium, the equilibrium will shift so as to relieve that stress.
So if you have too much of one part, so if a system is at equilibrium and you add more product or you add more reactant, that is going to stress that system, and the system will shift to accommodate that excess product or that excess reactant.
So let's see some examples of a stress we could put on a system at equilibrium. First, we could modify the concentration of any of the compounds. Let's say we add some of this reactant. That will unbalance the equilibrium, and the forward reaction will speed up to use up some of the additional reactants, turn them into products, and restore equilibrium. The equilibrium is said to have shifted right.
Right. So you had too much of A and it pushed the reaction in the direction of B, so it shifted the reaction to the right.
If we add more products, it would shift left.
Right. And so that's exactly what we see as we go through. If you have too much CO2, it shifts the reaction to the right. If you have too much hydrogen ion, it'll shift the reaction to the left. And I want to take you through some figures that'll really help you get that in your head. So the way that your book shows it to you is it has homeostasis, and then it says what happens if PCO2 goes up. When blood carbon dioxide increases, we get more carbonic acid, and then we end up with more hydrogen ion, and that lowers the pH. And so it's like this seesaw. It starts out at equilibrium, but if we get an excess here, it pushes the reaction to the right. We get too much acid, and the pH goes down. Again, starting at homeostasis, if the pH were to go up, then we could blow off that CO2 in order to get ourselves back to this homeostasis. Now, this is an older version of this figure. This is the way this figure used to appear in a previous edition of the textbook. And I like it a little bit better because it's a little bit simpler. Okay? And so they're saying if the CO2 rises, then acidosis develops because this shifts it to the right and there's too much hydrogen ion, the pH goes down. If PCO2 falls, if PCO2 falls, the reaction shifts this way because now we have too much. We have an excess of the products. We have an excess of hydrogen ion, and it pushes the reaction back to the left. Alkalosis will then develop because the pH goes up. And what we want to do with acid-base balance is maintain this equilibrium. So an acidosis is either because we have too much CO2, or if we bring the CO2 back down to normal, we can restore homeostasis. Alkalosis is too little CO2. So if we increase the concentration of the CO2, that'll bring us back to homeostasis. Okay? And that's a little bit of a hint about ways that we can compensate for acidosis and alkalosis. Okay, so this carbonic acid bicarbonate buffer system is based on carbonic acid acting as a weak acid and bicarbonate acting as a weak base. Because CO2 and water combine, a lot of respiratory problems can get us into these acid-base imbalances. Because it may be that we have an excess or that we have a shortage of CO2. The other way we can get into these imbalances is to have too much metabolic acid or too much metabolic base. So one of the things that we can do to compensate is we can change the breathing rate to change the exhalation of carbon dioxide. An increase in carbon dioxide lowers the pH, right? That's what this says. If you have too much CO2, it pushes it this way and it lowers the pH. It gets it more acidic. Because this acid can be breathed out, we can convert it back to CO2 and exhale CO2. That's why it's called a volatile acid. So changing in the rate and the depth of breathing can alter the pH of body fluids. Exhaling CO2 lowers the amount of acid or raises the pH of the blood. And that's why you have to be well versed in pH, so that it makes sense to you that lower hydrogen ion concentration raises the pH. Okay? So, too much CO2, based on this, too much CO2 causes acidosis. So if we blow off that CO2, we can come back to homeostasis. Too little CO2 causes alkalosis. So restoring regular breathing patterns will bring us back into balance. Okay? And so that's what the figures in your book are showing. Excess CO2 causes acidosis. Too little CO2 will cause alkalosis. And one of the ways that we can fix this condition is have more CO2, just enough to bring us back to homeostasis. Not too much to get us into acidosis, just enough to bring us back to homeostasis. Okay? All right. When we get into acidosis, that gives us depression of synaptic transmission in the central nervous system. So that can be someone who's very sleepy. That can be someone who's kind of hard to wake up. Alkalosis results in overexcitability. That can be confusion. That can be not really being able to control movements very well. Like if somebody drops something and sees very confused, then they may be in an alkalosis kind of an imbalance. The quickest way to fix these acid-base imbalances is to compensate for them using the respiratory system. Now this only works if their respiratory system is physiologically capable of doing it. If they got into acidosis or alkalosis because their lungs weren't working, their lungs aren't going to automatically start working better to get them out of the situation. But that's where renal compensation will come in. Okay? So respiratory compensation is increasing or decreasing the rate of respiration to alter the pH by either lowering or raising the PCO2. When PCO2 rises, pH falls, right? That was our figure right here. When PCO2 rises, pH falls. We have to blow off this CO2 to get back to normal. We have to increase the rate and depth of breathing to get back to homeostasis. When PCO2 falls, pH rises. And that drives the buffer system to the left. We would actually have to bring up the CO2 slightly, just enough to get us back to homeostasis. But respiratory compensation only works if the lungs are working. So these would be types of compensation that would work against a metabolic acidosis or a metabolic alkalosis. The other thing that we can do is we can use the kidneys. Okay? We can dump hydrogen ion or retain hydrogen ion depending on what we need to change the plasma pH. Now this takes a little bit of time, so it's not as quick as respiratory compensation, but if you have emphysema, your emphysema is not automatically going to correct itself so that you can blow off the CO2 that you need. Okay? So let's look at a couple of figures. Now there looks like there's a lot going on in this figure. So what I did was I cut out this middle part of the figure for us to look at. This is just our basic equation. CO2 plus H2O, carbonic acid, hydrogen, and bicarbonate ion. And so what happens if there's too much hydrogen ion? This is an acidosis situation. Well, we can convert it to CO2. Increased respiratory rate can blow off that excess CO2, or we can send that hydrogen either to some buffer systems where they can absorb it and make it not affect the pH so much, or we can dump it at the kidney. Kidney tubules respond by secreting that hydrogen, and it goes down that ureter. Okay, so then what happens if we remove hydrogen? This is going to be an alkalosis kind of state. Okay, it's going to shift our equation this way, and we're going to do things like conserve hydrogen ion and instead dump bicarbonate. The buffer systems that have been holding on to that hydrogen now can release it, and we can start to get back to that even teeter-totter toward homeostasis. Right? So our two main ways that we can compensate for any of these disorders is the lungs and the kidneys. All right. So we're going to go through our 4 types pretty quickly. Respiratory acidosis is where we have too much CO2 and it made that pH go down. Emphysema, pulmonary edema, airway obstruction, that decreases the movement of CO2 out, and so we accumulated too much CO2 in our body. Well, our lungs aren't going to automatically heal themselves in 5 minutes. So here the kidneys compensate. They dump that hydrogen ion, and that can bring blood pH back up to normal. Now, overall, long term, you want to do ventilation therapy because the goal is to help repair those lungs. But immediately, the kidneys can help even that out. Respiratory alkalosis is going to be the opposite, low PCO2. Sometimes this can be hyperventilation, or it can be due to stroke. So when someone's breathing rate increases, they're blowing off too much CO2. And so now we have abnormally low CO2 in systemic arterial blood. Sometimes when people travel to high altitude where the air gets thin, they start to hyperventilate. If someone's having an anxiety attack, they can be hyperventilating. And a lot of times that's not automatically going to change itself. Okay? So again, renal compensation helps. But if you've ever heard of having somebody breathe into a paper bag, that's a CO2 concentrator. Okay? That's going to be concentrating the CO2 so that they're breathing in a little more CO2 with each breath, trying to get this up, again, just to the level of homeostasis. Now, the other types of acidosis and alkalosis are metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. Metabolic acidosis is when we lose too much bicarbonate. This can be from something like severe diarrhea or renal dysfunction. Hyperventilation can help, but then we want to do something long-term to help correct the cause of acidosis. And then metabolic alkalosis is where we end up with too much bicarbonate. Now keep in mind that when we do our big equation, we're pulling apart hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. right? And so too much acid is because we've lost too much bicarbonate. That's our metabolic acidosis, right? We've lost too much bicarbonate. We're left with too much acid behind. Here, we lose too much acid and we're left with too much bicarbonate behind. So this is going to be any non-respiratory loss of acid, excessive vomiting, gastric suctioning that takes all of that hydrochloric acid out of the stomach, excessive intake of alkaline drugs like antacids because they have things like magnesium bicarbonate in them. Use of certain diuretic drugs can cause abnormally high bicarbonate. Hypoventilation will help, and then again, long term, we're going to need to correct the fluid and electrolyte imbalances. So now we can look at the figures. Now that we've kind of gone through our 4 basic types, we can look at what the figures are showing us. So normal acid-base balance, this is disturbed because we have too much CO2 caused by hypoventilation. So emphysema, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, pulmonary edema, airway obstruction, results in too much PCO2, and so we can increase the respiratory rate, and that'll work to some extent, but then the kidneys can secrete that hydrogen ion and we can restore blood pH. Respiratory alkalosis, now we have too little CO2 caused by hyperventilation. So if we can do something to decrease the respiratory rate, if we can find a way to rebreathe PCO2, or the kidneys can secrete bicarbonate, and in exchange for that, they'll reabsorb this hydrogen ion into the peritubular capillaries, and together those actions can bring the blood pH back up. Metabolic acidosis can result from either increased acid production or decreased acid excretion. Here we can just increase the respiratory rate and blow off the excess PO2 to bring the blood pH back down to normal. Here we end up having decreased bicarbonate. Due to bicarbonate loss, that can be excessive diarrhea. This can be there's a couple things that can cause this metabolic acidosis. And so what we're going to try to do is bring blood pH back up to normal. We can do that by increasing respiratory rates. And here the kidneys are going to secrete hydrogen ion to try to bring the level back up to normal homeostasis. And then we've got one more. Metabolic alkalosis. Didn't we just go through this? Oh, no, we did not. Aren't these the same figure? Yeah, because this is not... Oh, it's the wrong figure. I'll have to see if I can put the right figure. But metabolic alkalosis is where we end up with losing too much acid, and that's how we end up with an excess of bicarbonate, right? So this can be excess vomiting. This can be gastric suctioning of all that hydrochloric acid in the stomach. Or this can be high bicarbonate because of ingestion. So what we do a lot of times in this kind of a situation is we're going to try to give fluids that are going to try to correct the pH as well as electrolyte balance so that we maintain fluid homeostasis, we maintain ionic homeostasis, and we correct the acid-base balance. Okay, so we've had 3 lectures that kind of go through and talk about these 3 ways that we can have homeostasis in these systems in the body. So first we started with fluid balance. How do we maintain body fluid homeostasis? Then we went through electrolyte balance, and in that lecture we focused mostly on the non-pH cations and anions. So we did sodium, we did chloride, we did potassium, and we did calcium. Your book goes through magnesium and phosphate and a couple of other ones. I just wanted to focus on the 4 main ones. And then we did the pH ion related ones with the acid-base balance. One of the things that you're going to want to try to hang on to is this figure, because this helps us remember the relationship between the level of carbon dioxide and the pH. And this figure, because this helps us remember what the body does in response to too much hydrogen. We can either blow it off at the lungs or dump it at the kidneys. Okay, so those are the 2 figures that are going to help you the most as you try to summarize our acid-base imbalances.